Well, so I did a double major when I was at Columbia. So I actually majored in history and political science. And you're right, I think it was sort of a circuitous path. But I'd actually always intended to go into graduate study. I only worked for a year in between undergraduate and when I applied for my graduate school, but I had wanted to work on the shrine of Sayyida Zainab. And some of this has been sort of a combination of like my own personal fascination, my background, and sort of like how the shrine has evolved over the years. So I do think that my background made me a little bit more interested in some of sort of like the political origins of the shrine. So a lot of the work that I had seen worked on the Sayyida Zainab really looked at kind of like the commercialization, the rituals, the aesthetics of the shrine after 1970s. And as somebody who is, a historian kind of by training, but also interested in some of these questions of like how governments deal with this space, I thought it would be a little bit more interesting to delve into the longer history of the shrine, right? I'd look kind of in the years before the 1970s and think about how, as the state of Syria is coming into being, the shrine played a role, right? As a place where people could debate questions of nationalism, of politics, of government, of gender. So I do think that sort of like intellectual interest comes from a little bit of like my undergraduate training, but I think personally, like my kind of fascination with the shrine just from visiting it when I was younger and being interested in the figure of Zainab herself and how she sort of becomes translated and embedded in different spaces, those things are what, brought all these various interests together in this project. But I think, for me, there was never really a question that I was going to go into a history program. I think sort of the training, the archival training, the methodology that I knew that I would receive there from, some of the people that I worked with. Even though I had a fairly interdisciplinary committee, I knew that was sort of the route that I wanted to start this project with. The project evolved over time, as I think most projects do, and so it came to encompass bigger questions, but the roots came from that sort of like dual interest in like kind of the politics, but then also the history of this space. Yeah, oh, well, that's a really good question, and I'm happy that you read that article, because I think that's actually something that it's almost like a tangential project that I was working on. So I thought it would be interesting to do a little bit of ethnographic field work in the South Asian Shia community. I am actually at a university where there's been actually an increasing focus on sort of Asian American studies and sort of like the methodologies and the imaginations of those communities. So UMBC got a huge grant from the Mellon Foundation to revamp the Asian American Studies program. And so I actually think it was interesting for me to then look at this sort of immigrant and diaspora community, a South Asian community in the United States that is both minoritized in terms of, South Asians have an ambiguous space when we think of Asian Americans, but also a minority community within a larger community of faith, right? So like, what does it mean to be a doubly minoritized community within the United States, but then also be sort of existing in this geopolitical moment where there's this opening of possibilities to travel, right? And imagine a different sacred geography, right? So how do these South Asian Muslims both contend with their sort of quote unquote heritage, right? And the geographies that their parents are part of versus the sort of opening of geographies and imaginations that travel and ziyarat has allowed them. So for me, I actually think this is kind of a project that's been going on the side that I'm sort of still interested in coming back to. But, on the one hand, I think I have a complicated relationship with this notion of like Karbala as like a sacred heartland, because on the one hand, I think so much of my immediate manuscript project is really decentering these spaces, right? It's decentering Iran, it's decentering Karbala as sort of like the center of the universe. In terms of the fieldwork that I'm doing and the chapters. And yet, when I went out and I did this sort of ethnographic work, right, interviewing these younger South Asian Shias in the United States, I found that they were consistently referring to the sort of longing for Karbala, the sense of belonging to the space, the sort of geography that maps their connection from the United States to Karbala, right? So I think how this is sort of part of me grappling with how do I think of sort of the intellectual work that I'm doing in my manuscript right now, with the very lived experiences of people who are telling me something different, right? Like I think sometimes as scholars of Shi'ism, we want to resist the temptation to say like everything is about Karbala and everything is about Iran, and yet you have people actually telling you, right, like I feel affinity to this space, I feel more connected when I go to Karbala than I do when I go to Pakistan or when I go to Hyderabad or when I go to any of these places, and so I think thinking about like what the South Asian Shia experience is in the United States actually will tell us a little bit more about Shia studies as well, right? I think Shia studies is often ignored the experience of American Shias as well. Like it's a much newer community, it's a much smaller community, and I think there's ways in which by looking at this group of people, we can sort of think more about how people imagine their identity in very real ways that kind of complicates our attempts to decenter Iran and Iraq. So I think obviously, people who work on these narratives will tell you they're as much about the subject as they are as the author, right? And sort of like trying to place the subject within a particular context and often justify sort of the stories that you're telling. So I think in the context of Bibi Paknam, what's sort of repeatedly comes out of these hagiographies is the sense of the predetermination, right? That she was always intended to come to this region because there was something about this region that would be sort of both spiritually instructive, but also that the people of this region would be sort of uniquely receptive to receiving the sort of quote-unquote true message of Islam. And so I think when you kind of think about this geography that's created, right, that she is somebody who is either from Medina or coming from Karbala, and being told that in Sindh and Hind, right, in this particular region, in a city that will come to be known as Lahore, that you will find both the place where you're supposed to deliver the final message, but also that people will be receptive to that message of what we think of as true Islam, right? So I think it's quite notable that when you see hagiographies that are sort of published and often sponsored by the government of Pakistan, you see very much, right, explicitly this part of the narrative. And Catherine Ewing and other people have sort of written about the way that the lives of quote-unquote saints, right, have functioned in the Pakistani context. And so the narratives around Bibi Paknam very much sort of follow that path, right? You have stories of sort of miracles, of good works, but what is unique about her, I think, is that she's placed in this sort of geography, right? All of these hagiographies begin with this narrative that as he lay dying, Ali ibn Abu Talib called his daughters forward and gave each one of them a place that they should travel to. So Zainab was given Damascus as her final destination, and Ruqayya bint Ali was given Lahore. And so I think it's that notion of like capitalizing on this predestination that gives almost sort of that kind of places Lahore in relation to places like Medina, right? In relation to places like Damascus, to the events of Karbala, and that creates. I think it's sort of part of this nationalist narrative, right? That this was a place that was always meant to be receptive to a message of Islam, right? Where somebody of that stature would come and find people who were receptive to that message, so that and that. That Lahore, is especially, right, is placed on the sacred geography. So I do think that these narratives work on multiple levels, right? They work on both placing this figure in a kind of transnational sacred geography, but then also in sort of reaffirming these nationalist narratives, right, of what it means to be Pakistan, right, and why Pakistan is an important Islamic space. I made a deliberate choice in my book not to have a sort of presentist reading of conflict back into the past, right? So I've often grappled with whether or not I want the manuscript to include a conversation about sort of like the current politics of sectarianism in the Middle East, in Pakistan, because I think I don't want to read back these sort of like present conflicts into the past, right? I'm very much interested in how, in particular spaces and moments, these identities are created and formed, right? And so I think what happens in Pakistan, what happens in Syria, what's happening in Iran, we can often, it can lead to a sense of, sort of sectarian identity is something fixed, right? And so, my point is that it's always relational, it's always sort of constructed in these sacred spaces. I do think that, looking just at Bibi Bakhdaman, what has been really interesting to me in the last decade or so is thinking about the debates that have happened around the shrine in terms of the renovation of the shrine. So I'm not sure if anybody is really familiar with this, but over the past 10, 15 years, there's been a series of court cases and litigations about what it would look like if the shrine was to be reinvented, to expand and renovated. And members of different, of the community, of the religious affairs community at Bibi Bakhdaman, and there are some who are Sunni and some who are Shia, have both submitted plans to the government of Pakistan of what they would want that shrine to look like. Shia members of the Religious Affairs Committee submitted a plan for the shrine that was essentially modeled on the shrine of Masum Maikum in Iran, sort of arguing that if this is in fact the daughter of Ali ibn Abu Talib, that there's a certain aesthetics and representation and ritual that should be sort of embedded in this space, right? That this should be a Shia shrine that looks in a certain way, right? Whereas, there are other models that are put forward that say, well, this is a shrine that's in Pakistan, and so we have to give a nod to kind of a different heritage. And so what I think is interesting is that you sort of see these sort of debates over identity taking place in terms of not just ritual, but like in aesthetics and architecture, like what it means to have a sacred space in a city like Lahore. What does that look like? But, what I've kind of shown in the chapter is that our periodization for what we think of as sectarian identity is often, I think, quite so, for example, I think when we're talking about Pakistan, you often see, like in the 1980s, right, like a discussion about sort of the rise of sectarianism in the 80s onwards. For me, the period that I'm really interested in looking at is sort of the 1960s, the early 1970s, which kind of predates Ziaul Haq's Islamization, predates many of the protests that we see happening in Shia communities, but is about like how local communities contest with this idea of like being Shia, right, being Sunni. Likewise, I'm a little bit less interested in the period after 2003, where you see the sort of heightened rhetoric about like violence, right, sectarian violence, suicide bombings, attacking Shia shrines, because I think that often gets us into like very standard paradigms of talking about like Sunni-Shia relations, right? For me, the period that I'm most interested in is like these sort of like understudied periods of thinking about Shia identity in Pakistan, right? So how in the early period of the state, right, 1950s, 1960s, you see these communities organizing in sacred spaces. And then in the present, how some of that identity is not expressed through sort of, violent protests, but in aesthetics, right, in architecture, in rituals, in public spaces. Yeah, absolutely. So the manuscript that I'm working on right now revolves around the figure of Zainab bint Ali and thinking about how she's sort of been translated, embedded, and contested in different, what I think of as sort of national spaces. So Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan, and uses her as a way to talk about how questions of gender, sectarianism, citizenship, and nationalism has been debated in these three spaces. So I am looking at the shrine of Sayyida Zainab in Damascus, the shrine of Bibi Bakhdaman in Pakistan, and then a prison in Iraq that was a prison for women called Al-Rashad, and sort of uses this figure of Zainab bint Ali as a way to look at how communities think about nationalism, gender, and citizenship in these spaces. So, it came out of my dissertation, but it has obviously evolved into a much larger project. And so the NEH Fellowship is in order to finish the manuscript, hopefully, for publication. But, it has been a project that has undergone many iterations, right? It started as a project on the Sayyida Zainab shrine, and then the dissertation was looking at these two shrines, the Sayyida Zainab and Bibi Bakhtam shrine, and the manuscript has sort of taken a kind of broader transnational look at these spaces and think about how communities use transnational narratives to kind of construct local identities.